Situation that either seriously endangers the lives.
Pleased to debut continuing debate, the Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will be splitting my time with the President of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada and the Minister of Emergency Preparedness. And I see that it's now Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased and honoured, but also do this with a deep sense of obligation, to rise today to speak to the invocation of the Emergencies Act by our government and to the motion in this House to affirm the government's decision. Canada is a rule of law country. By declaring a public order emergency under the Emergencies Act, we followed the law and we are acting within it. There are clear conditions set out in the Emergencies Act in order for a public order emergency to be declared. Our government believes those conditions have been met and that those same conditions required the Government of Canada to act. La loi sur les mesures d'urgence.
The Emergencies Act exists since 1988 and replaced the War Measures Act. It differs from the War Measures Act in two significant ways. First, the Emergencies Act contains a number of parameters and safeguards in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
The preamble to the Emergencies Act states, and whereas the Governor and Council, in taking such special temporary measures, would be subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights, and must have regard to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, particularly with respect to those fundamental rights that are not to be limited or abridged even in a national emergency. Madam Speaker, any and all of our government action will be subject to the Charter, and it is my job as Attorney General to ensure this. I take that responsibility incredibly seriously. There is therefore a further check in the parliamentary oversight process as well. The Emergencies Act can only be invoked in specific, serious circumstances that amount to a national emergency. In order to meet the thresholds for a national emergency, three conditions must be met. First, we must be in a situation that either seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and exceeds the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it, or seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. Second, the provinces' and territories' capacity to handle the situation must be considered insufficient or show gaps. And third, we must conclude that the situation cannot be handled adequately under any other Canadian law, including provincial or territorial laws. Our government believes these conditions were met, and yesterday we tabled an explanation of the reasons for issuing the declaration as required by the Act. We also tabled yesterday, as required, a report on any consultation with the provinces with respect to the declaration. I would especially like to highlight the support of British Columbia, Ontario, and Newfoundland and Labrador, as noted in the document of invoking the Act to respond to this national emergency. Une fois l'urgence déclarée,
once the emergency is declared, the Emergencies Act allows the federal government to adopt decrees or regulations that are required to intervene. Our government respects Canadians' rights and freedoms as protected by the Charter, and it is our intent to only use the powers necessary, reasonable, measured, and necessary powers to solve the crisis swiftly under Section 1 of the Charter.
Our government has introduced targeted orders under the Act. While the Act technically applies to tailor orders to be as focused as possible, and only in those places affected by blockades and illegal occupations will we see any change at all. We have introduced the following measures to bring the situation under control. Temporary regulation and prohibition of public assemblies that lead to a breach of the peace and go beyond lawful protest. The situation in Ottawa and blockades at certain border crossings have gone far beyond lawful protest. Temporarily designating and securing places where blockades are to be prohibited. This could include borders, approaches to borders, critical infrastructure, hospitals, and democratic institutions. Temporarily directing persons to render essential services to relieve impacts of blockades on Canada's economy. This could include tow trucks and their drivers, for compensation, of course. Temporarily authorizing or directing financial institutions to render essential services to relieve the impact of blockades, including regulating and prohibiting the use of property to fund or support the blockades. Temporarily enabling the RCMP to enforce municipal bylaws and provincial offences where required. And finally, temporary imposition of fines or imprisonment for contravention of any order or regulation made under Section 19 of the Emergencies Act. Madame la Présidente, nous traversons une période.
Madam Speaker, we are living an extraordinary period, and the Government of Canada has pledged to respect and protect individual rights while maintaining public order. This includes all measures taken by the Canadian government under the Emergencies Act, including orders or actions of government representatives.
To repeat what I previously stated, it is my responsibility and commitment as Attorney General of Canada to ensure that all steps taken by our government are consistent with the Charter as required by the Act. The Emergencies Act, Madam Speaker, also contains a number of significant limits, checks, and safeguards. As required by the Act, on several occasions over the past week, the Prime Minister and members of Cabinet consulted with the Premiers and members of their respective governments. Having now declared a public order emergency, we tabled the declaration in Parliament, as required, within 7 days. And in fact, we did so as quickly as possible, well before the 7 days, tabling yesterday for discussion today so that Parliament could perform its important oversight role. In the coming days, a parliamentary committee will be struck to provide oversight while the emergency is in effect. This declaration only lasts for 30 days, unless renewed. However, we can, and we sincerely hope to, revoke the emergency much sooner. Le Parlement a le pouvoir.
Parliament has the power to repeal a decree which ensures that all measures taken will be done so responsibly, moderately, and while respecting the criteria established.
2 days for review of parliamentarians, as was done yesterday. Parliament has the power to amend or revoke any order made under the Act. In closing, I want to address two critiques of the official opposition. They say this declaration is unnecessary. The illegal blockades and occupations are ending. I say, look outside. They are not. I say, look at the streets of Winnipeg. The ones that have ended did so after the Prime Minister announced we were moving to declare a public order emergency. We are achieving what we intended to achieve with these measures, and we're doing it in a most measured and responsible way. We have seen further how fluid the situation is. Since we declared this emergency, we have seen other potential blockades stopped. We want law enforcement to have the necessary tools for a limited time to ensure we do not have a repeat of any of the blockades. The official opposition is talking about rights. On this side of the House, we take rights seriously. So did the Progressive Conservative government that introduced the Emergencies Act and ensured it was Charter compliant. That was the right thing to do. We are invoking this act to end illegal blockades and occupations. We are invoking it to restore the rights of those who cannot walk safely on the streets of downtown Ottawa. We are invoking it to protect the rights of workers to earn a living, of businesses to serve the public, for people to move freely across international borders. Let's not confuse illegal blockades and occupations with lawful protest. We know what a lawful protest looks like. It does not look like what is happening on Wellington Street or what transpired in Coutts or in Emerson. So we have declared a public order emergency to help law enforcement deal with these issues quickly and to protect us from them happening again. Our goal, Madam Speaker, is to see order restored and for this emergency declaration to be lifted as soon as possible. Thank you. Merci.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Act expressly prohibits violation of Charter rights. The declaration put forward by the government assumes power to regulate or prohibit private transfers of funds to protesters, including the ability to mandate the reporting of such transfers and freezing of accounts without judicial oversight. How is this measure compliant with Section 8 Charter rights to be free from unreasonable search and seizure?
Well, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.
I thank the honourable member for the question, Madam Speaker. Indeed, this Act is compliant with Section 8 of the Charter against unreasonable search and seizure. It is an extension of procedures and practices that already exist with respect to anti-terrorism financing and money laundering, Madam Speaker. So we are extending these practices and procedures that already exist, that are already Charter compliant, and to this other situation, i.e. funding illegal blockades and protests, and we are going to do it in a reasonable manner. It will be Charter compliant, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Avignon, Limites, Matapédia. I'd like to thank the Minister for his speech. I think we all agree on this side of the House that this is a last resort, and I feel that the current situation shows us that we're not at that point. There are a number of other tools that could have been used prior to this, and I believe that we're sort of playing down the importance of the Emergencies Act. And I'm no lawyer, but we know perfectly well that there are tools under the Criminal Code that could have been used well before coming to the Emergencies Act. For example, charging people criminally who are blocking the streets. So why didn't we do that? I'd like him to explain then why those tools were not used before getting to the Emergencies Act. Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Justice. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her question. What we found from the beginning of the crisis, and obviously we've worked with the governments across Canada, and with the RCMP. The RCMP has also worked with the other police forces. And what we saw is that there were gaps. We had to work together. And so what we did with these measures, which did not exist before, is we gave other tools. We were able to give other tools to police forces across Canada in each jurisdiction, in order to better supervise their situation using more effective tools to ensure that these situations are better managed. So we're filling in the gaps, Madam Speaker.
James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I've been here for much of the last 3 weeks, and what I've seen in Ottawa is a complete failure of civic officials and a complete failure of the police. This should never have been allowed to spiral. We saw in Quebec City and Toronto the police did their job. We saw at the Ambassador Bridge the ridiculous situation that our bridge could be shut down for 8 days without action. So now we're having to take these measures. And I want to ask the Minister, because he's talking about anti-terrorism measures, is the government able to tell this House that they have evidence that there is terrorism and extremism, that they can justify this, or are we just having to clean up the mess for the failure of what happened here in Ottawa?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Madam Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, delivered with his usual passion in this important circumstance. Madam Speaker, I mentioned terrorism as part of the financing. This isn't a terrorism act. We took measures that had been applied to terrorism. We've applied it to other illegal activity. But I'm not equating this to terrorism. What we have done is declare a public order emergency based on the reasons we gave in the declaration that we have made. They include the very deleterious economic impact to the kinds of workers that the honourable member has tried to protect throughout his whole career. Think of auto workers in southwestern Ontario or Niagara. Think of beef farmers. Think of pork farmers out west whose supply chains were blocked in trading with our largest trading partner. Madam Speaker, we have declared a public order emergency based on those very serious grounds. We needed to act. We had been there from the beginning. We saw gaps. We filled them. Now we've given better tools to the police.
Debate, the Honourable Minister for Emergency Preparedness and President of the Queen's Privy Council.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it is a privilege to have the opportunity to rise today as the Minister of Emergency Preparedness to speak to the importance and necessity of the motion before the House. But, Madam Speaker, let me also acknowledge that the fact that we are all in this House, that elected representatives from across Canada have come to debate this important measure, is evidence of the strength and resiliency of our democratic institutions, Madam Speaker. And although the subject of today's debate is a solemn one, I think it is also evidence that should give us strength, resolve, and hope. Madam Speaker, let me begin my remarks by acknowledging the impact that these blockades and demonstrations have had on Canadian citizens, particularly for the people of Ottawa, who have been subject to intimidation and threats, a disruption of the course of their lives that, frankly, Madam Speaker, is unacceptable. Among the most important freedoms that we covet and protect in this country is the freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly. Lawful, peaceful protest. But, Madam Speaker, it's also been said, your freedom to swing your fist ends at the end of my nose. And what we have seen, unfortunately, over the past 3 weeks, is those rights have been exceeded and abused to the point that it's put Canadians in harm's way. Madam Speaker, I also want to speak briefly about the impact of the blockades that were taking place at vital trade corridors in this country, our international borders. Madam Speaker, when the protesters decided to go to our borders, we need to recognize and acknowledge they were going for the throat. They were going to cut off the supply of goods and services that our country relies on. When they stopped parts from coming across that border at the Ambassador Bridge, they shuttered factories. They idled workers. They damaged the reputation of Canada as a safe and stable place to invest. They hurt Canadians. It was clearly their intent. It is clearly what they were doing. And, Madam Speaker, it had to stop. And we saw the same targeted approach to hurt Canadian interest, to harm their fellow citizens in Coutts, Alberta, in South Surrey, British Columbia, in Emerson, certainly at the Ambassador Bridge, a number of feints at other border points. This was not by accident. They didn't just wander into those spaces. They went for the throat of this country. And, Madam Speaker, they created an emergency that we had to respond to. And, Madam Speaker, for the first time, we have come to the difficult decision to invoke the authorities of the Emergency Act. And I want to assure this House, from the very outset, our government recognized the significance of this decision, the heavy responsibility that would come with pursuing it. Not just the responsibility of this government, but of this House. We approached the process with caution and with care. It was essential that we explore all options available to us, Madam Speaker. We looked at everything very closely. We looked at our existing legislation. We looked at the regulations that support the Department of Justice officials, with the support of our Department of Justice officials, to see what additional federal supports would be required. We examined existing municipal, provincial, and federal authorities. Madam Speaker, I think it's rather evident. The threat of parking tickets did not deter those trucks in Ottawa. The threat of the enforcement of the Ontario Highway Traffic Act did not deter those commercial carriers from coming down our highways and using their vehicles, which are licensed under that legislation, to cause harm to Canadians. And it has also become clear of the limitations of even the authorities enshrined within federal law and the criminal code that our law enforcement officials were struggling. One of the things that became evident, and I'll give you two examples that I hope would be helpful to to the Parliament in consideration of the necessity for these measures. One of the challenges that our law enforcement officials had, and not just our law enforcement officials, but those who are tasked with gathering and analyzing financial intelligence through FinTrack. Unfortunately, the funding associated to these actions which in many cases have been clearly criminal and harmful to Canadians, was opaque. And it became very clear when our officials came to us and said they did not have the tools that they needed to provide the necessary and appropriate scrutiny of the source of that funding, and they did not have the tools to bring the accountability and even the consequences that were required to do their jobs. We listened, Madam Speaker. We listened to what they needed. We looked at the important Ontario, for example, declared an emergency and brought forward really important and useful regulations. But they couldn't do that because it was our responsibility. And so we considered that. We listened. Another example, Madam Speaker, and this may sound trivial, but it was significant. Jurisdictions right across the country. I heard from my counterpart and colleague, the minister responsible in Alberta, who for weeks has been asking for help to get tow trucks down to Coutts, Alberta, to haul those trucks away. And yet the tow truck industry in Alberta, like in Ontario, like right across the country, as a result of threats and intimidation, they were afraid to do their job. We needed that equipment. We needed those drivers. We needed their ability to remove those vehicles. But, Madam Speaker, they were intimidated and afraid. And so we brought forward in these measures an authority to not to compel them, but to really authorize them to do what we all needed them to be done. And, Madam Speaker, I just might submit to you all, these measures work. People who knew the gaps in our laws, the gaps in law enforcement's response, they were exploiting it. And when we closed that gaps, they went to school. And we saw evidence of it in Coutts. Now, I don't want to minimize the importance of the RCMP investigation. And by the way, I'm not going to comment on any aspect of their investigation or the prosecution that will follow. It's totally inappropriate for a minister to do so. But I want to thank them for doing their job. And I want to thank God that they were able to do it safely. That eliminated part of the threat at Coutts. But when we announced on Monday that we were coming for the source of their funding, that there were going to be real consequences, financial consequences for their actions, they scurried away. And that's exactly what we needed them to do. They did exactly the same thing in Emerson, Manitoba. And even though we've seen yesterday in Windsor, some of them were going back because this is the way they can most effectively attack this country. They were stopped. They were stopped by effective law enforcement. And so, Madam Speaker, we have brought forward these measures. But let me also assure all my colleagues in this House, these measures must always be charter compliant. Our expectation is that our law enforcement officials will do their job, the job we all need them to do. But they will always do it mindful of their responsibility to uphold the rule of law, to effect their lawful purpose with a minimum amount of force, to do the work right. And I also want to assure this House, Madam Speaker, we'll be there to support them. We'll be there to support them. When they say we need tools, we'll give them the tools to do the job. And when they say we need resources, we'll provide those resources to do the job. Madam Speaker, every order of government and every person in this House has a responsibility to stand up with resolve and determination and to do what is necessary to protect Canada's interests. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parker.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would note that the Deputy Director of Intelligence for FinTrack, Barry McKillop, would disagree with the Minister's suggestion that there is extremist financing of the convoy. But I'll move on to my question. Back in January through March 2020, as the Minister said, these people came for the throat. What happened to the throat of our country when our railways were being blockaded, when our pipelines were being blockaded? We couldn't even get propane to Quebec in the middle of the winter, risking the lives of so many seniors. The port of Metro Vancouver was blockaded. And now this government said we needed to initiate dialogue. We needed to work with these people to come to a peaceful resolution. What is any different with this current situation that we're facing? Why is the Emergencies Act needed?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Let me just speak to the member's first point, because I heard him ask the question before, and perhaps he hasn't been satisfied with the answer. I understand. I also speak to FinTrack often, and I've worked with them for decades. They didn't have the evidence because they didn't have the tools to collect the evidence. We listened to them. They said it's opaque. We don't have the tools to examine cryptocurrency wallets, for example. And we said, we hear you. You don't have the evidence, we'll give you the tools to go collect the evidence because it's necessary to protect Canadians. So, Madam Speaker, the member's argument against these measures is clearly a little bit shallow. And he needs to recognize he's right. We didn't have that information. Now we're getting that information. It's what our law enforcement officials need to protect the country.
The Honourable Member from Mirabel. Thank you, Madam Speaker. We agree that the situation is serious. The problem is that for more than 2 weeks, only the opposition said it was an emergency. The Prime Minister gave up on his obligation to use the tools he had at his disposition. Quebecers and Canadians deserve better. I would like to know if the Honourable Minister is proud to be seated aside a Prime Minister of last resort.
Minister.
I want to assure the member, not only am I proud, it is the honour of my life to be a member of this government serving Canadians. But, Madam Speaker, I also want to be very clear. We have been seized from the very first moment in supporting law enforcement's efforts, but not also the efforts of our municipal and provincial partners. We've been working closely with provincial governments right across the country, including in Quebec. And, Madam Speaker, I want to also take this opportunity, if I may, to acknowledge that we respect very much the jurisdiction of provinces and territories over policing in their jurisdiction, as I'm sure they recognize and respect our responsibility to maintain the integrity and security of our borders. Madam Speaker, all orders of government have a responsibility to protect Canadians, and we'll all work together to do it.
The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Madam Speaker, I understand and share the concerns that people have about the potential long-term impacts of the use of emergency measures legislation, and in particular, as it relates to the expansion of the institution of policing, given their past abuses and overreach against legitimate political actions by Indigenous, racial and climate justice activists and workers. And yet, with the capital and country in crisis, Canadians are feeling abandoned by their local police services, who have repeatedly been caught on video, compromised, and at times seem to be working in collusion with the insurrectionist occupation. Madam Speaker, the last Royal Commission on Policing was in 1962. Will the Minister of Public Safety commit to establishing a national commission on policing that would review the duties assigned to the police and their corresponding budgets? And will the minister commit to a secretariat or some other office to report on the radicalization and use of public resources in security forces for undemocratic ends?
Minister.
Well, I thank my colleague for the question, and I think one of the things that has become quite apparent, and I've heard concern across the country as well, an overwhelming desire that the police in this country do their job, and that they do it right. Madam Speaker, that they do it in a way which is compliant with all of our laws, with our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that their response is measured, thoughtful, proportional, and effective. Madam Speaker, and we're working hard to make sure they have the tools and the support that they need. But I will also say, I spent 40 years in policing. Policing must be always accountable to the people they serve, because the most important tool that the police have is the trust and confidence of the people they serve. And, Madam Speaker, we'll always work to maintain that trust and confidence.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the Minister of Emergency Preparedness for his comments this morning. My question is with respect to what I'm hearing. I appreciated his sharing the care and caution that this is being applied with. The Prime Minister shared a more targeted approach. But I need to also reconcile that with what I'm reading in the regulations we've been provided with, mention of critical infrastructure quite broadly. I share the concerns of the member from Burnaby South, for example, with respect to how this could be applied in future to Indigenous land defenders, to climate activists. Could he clarify the difference between the more targeted approach we're hearing and the words we're seeing here?
Honourable Minister, in 30 seconds or less.
I want to thank the member for the question, and I understand the concern. I want to provide him with reassurance. These measures are time limited. They are subject to parliamentary and judicial scrutiny, and we will only use these measures as long as they are required. We recognize their extraordinary nature. They have to be subject to the scrutiny of this House. It's in the law. And we will only use them as long as they are required, and we will always ensure that they are compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Unlike the Prime Minister and ministers across, it actually gives me no pleasure to rise to speak on the matter at hand. The invocation of the Emergencies Act earlier this week, for the first time in Canadian history, is a significant moment, and it's not a moment to be pleased about. It's a solemn moment. It's a moment where we have to ask ourselves, how did we get to the situation we're here in the first place? And when we examine the evidence of how we got to this situation, I don't think there's much for this government to be proud of. Now, the Conservatives thoughtfully considered the justifications written in law and given by this government for the enacting of the Emergencies Act. This government has based their justification on one provision, that a public order emergency exists throughout Canada. This claim is not supported by the evidence. Yes, we have seen border blockades in at least 4 provinces, and we have seen a persistent and now declared illegal protest in Ottawa. Before the Emergencies Act was invoked, the blockades at the borders and across Canada were lifted, or were well into the process of being lifted. So the government trying to claim credit after the fact is completely absurd. The Emergencies Act is now being used solely for the purpose of addressing the situation in Ottawa, not throughout Canada as defined by the Act. Now, a key part of the threshold for enacting these measures is that existing laws and capabilities have proven insufficient for dealing with the problem. Madam Speaker, existing laws are well equipped to deal with these situations. They were well equipped to deal with the situation at Coots, Emerson, at the Ambassador Bridge, and I submit that they are well equipped to be used here in Ottawa. The Minister of Justice said earlier, and the Minister of Emergency Preparedness, that they were required to pass this so they could requisition essential services like tow trucks. But it has been noted by many that under the criminal code, police already have the authority to requisition such services under pain of criminal sanction. That was before the Emergencies Act was brought in. So this argument that the Emergencies Act was necessary is completely absurd. I also want to note that I will be splitting my time with my honourable colleague from Regina Cabell. Now, the police already had the power to compel many of these services. The police already had the power to be coordinated with the RCMP, with the OPP, and the various police forces and national security forces throughout Canada. They have measures existing under the criminal code, mischief, intimidation, to be used against illegal protesters and blockades. Now, the government has used an argument where they're citing potential acts and threats of violence against Canadians and critical infrastructure. And this is not just any violence, they're saying. This is violence intended for the furtherance of an ideological and political objective. I'm very concerned with the language that this government is beginning to use, because that language is very similar to the language used under terrorism laws. The definition of terrorism is the use of violence to advance a political or ideological agenda. This government is using terrorism legislation against Canadian protesters. Wow. There is very little evidence that there was a serious threat to persons and critical infrastructure from these protests. There was a short-term risk. It was dealt with by law enforcement. I am very concerned, I'll address the member's question there, Ms. Heckel. I am very concerned about the situation that occurred around Coots, Alberta, where a small group of militants were arrested with firearms and with the intent to do harm. I am so thankful for law enforcement, for their efforts in taking down this very real threat. And I am so confident in our law enforcement because I know they have been planning this operation for weeks. They have likely infiltrated this group. They had a plan in place, and they had the appropriate tools and expertise to deal with this dangerous situation and defuse it before it became a very real and dangerous situation. And the fact is, Madam Speaker, that they did this before the imposition of the Emergencies Act. Clearly, they had the tools. This undermines the government's complete argument that they are justified because there were tools that were insufficient to deal with the problems. The tools have been insufficient. The threshold has not been met. I want to address some comments that have been made by this government. The Minister of Public Safety at a press conference stated very clearly and definitively that there is a connection between that militant faction at Coots and protesters here in Ottawa. He declined to provide any evidence to back up that assertion. He was asked repeatedly by media to back up that assertion, and he failed to back up that claim. His only evidence was citing social media posts and a general tone that has been seen in protests across Canada. Now, this government has been very quick to label protesters and anyone who would oppose their political agenda. Even before the protests began, the Prime Minister called people who oppose mandatory vaccinations, which the Prime Minister did earlier in 2021, he has called them racist, misogynist, among other epithets. Now, since the beginning of the protests, the government has sought to brand and label all protesters as fringe extremists with, quote, unacceptable views. Despite this unrelenting scrutiny and rhetoric, there has still been no evidence that there are violent extremists in Ottawa. In fact, if there were, I don't know how the government could be responsible in allowing us all to be here today and walk the streets of Ottawa. It undermines their whole claim. There is no evidence that there is a plot to violently overthrow the Canadian government, despite constant repetition and saying so. I remember there was a quote from a previous Liberal minister that says, if you tell a lie big enough and loudly enough, people will totally believe it. This government is constantly saying something that they do not have the evidence to back up. And I'd like to see that evidence if they have it. We deserve to see that evidence. This act was not designed and not intended to crack down on peaceful protesters, even if they are protesting illegally. We have other laws for dealing with this. The government is citing a so-called terrorist threat, but protesters in Ottawa, it's very inconvenient, it's terrible for the people of downtown Ottawa, but honking your horns does not meet the threshold of a terrorist organization, and the government knows that. Without further evidence of a violent threat, I cannot in good conscience support the invocation of this Emergency Act. But even if I were to accept that the government has met the threshold for calling the emergency powers, I would still have serious reservations about the powers that the government says they need to deal with this situation. If they believed there was a threat to critical infrastructure and persons, which they say they believe, I could support. If they showed evidence, I could support declaring Parliament Hill and certain sensitive areas to be a no-go zone. I could accept that we need better coordination between the RCMP and local police. But what I cannot accept is the necessity of the government undermining Section 8 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees Canadians' rights from unreasonable search and seizure to have their bank accounts frozen. The Minister of Justice on a panel last night said, if you are part of a so-called pro-Trump organization, you should be worried. I think all Canadians should be worried when a Minister of Justice threatens people because of their political views. That is not the Canada that any of us want to see, and it's unacceptable, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, throughout this debate, which we are going to be having over the next number of days, Canadians will know that their official opposition is alive and well. We are prepared to stand up for Canadians' rights. We are prepared to hold this government accountable. We're going to keep fighting. We're not going to stop standing up for Canadians' rights and freedoms. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
To the Minister of Justice.
Yep. To the Honourable.
That's to the previous Parliament, Madam Speaker.
Sorry.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. And I listened to the member's speech as I was actually walking over here on CPAC, and I'll respectfully, and I do want to try and reduce the tone of this debate, point out a couple of things. One is that what happened in Coutts, Alberta is extremely concerning for any Canadian, and I presume all parliamentarians that are concerned about violence. Secondly, that people, including outside of this very building, have openly called for the overthrow of a duly elected government, including an entity calling itself Canadian Unity. I think that is direct evidence of an ideological imperative or agenda that is being pursued. But the last point that I would gently point out to the member opposite is that I appreciated his submissions, and I mean that with all sincerity. But all that is being extended here with respect to laws that are already compliant with Section 8 of the Charter that relate to unreasonable search and seizure and FinTrack is ensuring that FinTrack can be applied to cryptocurrency and to crowdfunding sources. Is that not a necessary initiative given the foreign funding that is streaming into this country right now? The member
for Sturgeon River Parkway.
I want to thank the honourable member for that very good question, because I was at Public Safety Committee when Deputy Director of Intelligence Barry McKillop answered a question from one of his colleagues who said, why aren't we covering these crowdfunding sources? That's obviously a big loophole. And the deputy director stated that the payment processors that move the money from individuals to the crowdsourcing pages report to FinTrack. And the Canadian banks that receive the money from the crowdsourcing efforts report to the Canadian government. He stated there are no such thing as anonymous donations because everyone must provide their name and their credit card. There are no anonymous donations. FinTrack knows exactly who's donating, exactly where the money's going. They have the tools that they need. We do not need this further infringement on Canadians' rights and freedoms.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was listening carefully to the Conservative colleague's speech. Clearly, the Bloc and the Conservatives intend to oppose this. That is the application of the Emergencies Act, but for visibly and clearly very different reasons. The Bloc is opposed because it is the unanimous will of the National Assembly of Quebec and the government in power in Quebec to not allow the federal government to interfere in its business and impose the Emergencies Act, which is a bit of a bitter pill for Quebecers who remember back to 1970. The colleague instead was talking about the absence of proof that there were in the demonstrations and the occupation that we currently see here in Ottawa, the absence of evidence that there are more radical elements that could threaten security and individuals and national security itself eventually. Can the colleague confirm that he doesn't see these in these illegal demonstrations elements that could be dangerous for public safety? Does he trust what he sees on social networks and what we see in other areas happening in terms of demonstrations? I'd like to have his comments on that. Thank you.
For Sturgeon River Parkland.
I want to thank the honourable member for that question. And you could go on Twitter right now and find some of the most outrageous, offensive, and criminal statements across Canada. But what we do not in this country is base the passage of laws and the invocation of emergency acts based upon the possibility of a threat. We must base it on a real threat. We must base it on evidence that there is a threat to Canadians. And the fact that we are allowed to walk freely through this parliamentary precinct with protesters less than 100 meters from us right now belies the fact that it undermines the claim that there is a serious threat to Canadian democracy. Thank you.
Member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The honourable colleague across the way, I find it very difficult. He's talking about that people were just honking their horns, and that he seemed to try and allude that this convoy was just a simple annoyance for the people in Ottawa. However, I've spoken to quite a few who are working in the downtown. I had a lovely young woman who served me lunch at a restaurant, and I asked her how she was doing. And she talked about the harassment. She talked about specific assaults. She talked about the assaults to friends of hers that were working in the market. That is what we need to address here. So I wonder if he could explain, Madam Speaker, why he seems to think that this is just a simple annoyance and why he would want to take away from the safeties of the people who are working and living in this downtown.
River Parkland.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. The member is putting words in my mouth. I'm not saying that this is a simple inconvenience for the people of downtown Ottawa. I'm not downplaying the experiences that she's telling. I believe they are true experiences. They're unacceptable experiences. And they are experiences that can be dealt with through existing laws. Harassment is a crime. Intimidation is a crime. It's up to police to enforce these measures. We do not need emergency powers to enforce existing laws. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Regina Capel.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague for agreeing to share his time with me. I think it's very important for Canadians to understand that this is in no way, the government's reaction, the government's proposal to invoke the Emergency Measures Act is in no way connected to public safety, to restoring order, or to upholding the rule of law. We know this because we know what they've done with previous protests and blockades. When the Prime Minister agrees with the aims of protesters, he does nothing. In fact, actually, it would be unfair to say he does nothing. He does nothing to end the blockades. He actually will send negotiators. He'll actually send government delegations to meet with protesters and even propose settlements and compromises when he agrees with the political aims of those protesting. We know this because in 2020, anti-energy protesters, anti-oil and gas worker protesters, held up vital transportation links for weeks, Madam Speaker. At the time, the Prime Minister had a much different tone. Let's take a look at what he said when vital transportation links, when rail lines were blockaded, crippling the Canadian economy for weeks and weeks at a time. He said, and I quote, "Therefore, we are creating a space for peaceful, honest dialogue with willing partners." Compare that to the rhetoric and inflammatory language that he has used over the past several weeks here in 2022. Make no mistake, Madam Speaker, the protests that are happening in Ottawa and that have taken place across the country are a direct result of the Prime Minister's actions and his rhetoric. The demonization of people who are fighting to get their rights back. After 2 years of incredible hardship, 2 years of politicians and government agencies telling people that they weren't allowed to have family members visit them inside their own home. After 2 years of governments telling business owners that they had to keep their doors shut and their employees laid off. After years of people not able to use the various support systems that they've had in their life, relying on friends and family. Gyms closed. Activities for children canceled. After 2 years of this, just as there is hope on the horizon, as other jurisdictions around the world and even here in Canada were lifting restrictions and easing mandates, the Prime Minister added a new one. He added a new restriction after 2 years of telling truck drivers that they were essential services, that they were be allowed to travel across the border to bring vital goods into our markets. After 2 years of deeming them that essential service, just as there was hope and reasons to lift restrictions and mandates, the Prime Minister added a new one without any data to back it up, without any evidence to back it up. Then when people started objecting to this, finally saying enough is enough, we want our freedoms back, Madam Speaker. It's time for the government to retreat back to the normal boundaries of government interference in our lives. When people started doing that, started to gather together to peacefully protest against government overreach, what did the Prime Minister do? He called them names, tried to smear them with broad brushes. He called them racists and misogynists. He asked the question, the rhetorical question, Madam Speaker, about whether or not we should tolerate these people. Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask the Prime Minister a question. What does not tolerating these people look like? Because what he's done over the past few weeks has just been shameful. This Prime Minister has lowered the office in which he serves to unprecedented depths. In my 17 years of being a member of Parliament, I've never seen a Prime Minister, for that matter, any other politician, so debase the office that they hold, hurling insults at people, referring to a Jewish member of this House as standing with people waving swastikas. Just outrageous, Madam Speaker. And I have to tell my honourable colleagues in the Liberal benches who have often admonished their political opponents for in any way, even sharing the same postal code as someone who may be holding an offensive flag or a placard with unacceptable language on it. And when Conservatives denounce that, that's not good enough for members of the Liberal Party. They say, you're supposed to paint the entire group protesting with that broad brush. But, Madam Speaker, they don't hold themselves to that same standard. I see many honourable members across the way, some of whom I've served with. I know them to be honourable people. I don't assume that they are all racists just because their leader has performed racist acts by putting on blackface so often in his life that he can't remember how many times he's done it. We don't paint every single Liberal member of Parliament with that brush. They have no problem being photographed with the Prime Minister, despite his history of racist acts. So neither should members of Parliament hold or paint the entire group of people who are protesting for their freedoms back with that same broad brush. The lengths at which this government, and indeed not just the government, but many of their friends in the corporate media, to paint every single person who's protesting, who's demanding an end to the restrictions, an end to mandates with that broad brush, Madam Speaker. You look at the lengths that they go to discredit and to dehumanize those people who are just fighting for their traditional civil liberties. And I ask you, Madam Speaker, if we kind of look at this in two different groups. On the one hand, you've got people who are saying after 2 years of hardship, 2 years of sacrifice, 2 years of being forced to comply with unprecedented government intrusion in our lives. Unprecedented. Government's telling you where you can go, who you can have in your house. That is a new level of government interference in our life that we have not seen in recent Canadian history. After 2 years of that, there's a group of people who are saying, I just don't believe I should be fired for making a health care decision. Then on the other hand, you've got a group of people who are saying that anybody who holds that view is a racist, a misogynist, an insurrectionist, Madam Speaker. You've got a group of people who are saying that government should have the ability to tell you who you can have in your house, whether or not your business is allowed to stay open. Which group seems more unreasonable, Madam Speaker? I would say after 2 years, those who are fighting against this government intrusion in their lives have a legitimate case to be made. Whether or not we agree with them or not, we must respect their right to advocate for their views. The Prime Minister has not provided any legitimate justification for bringing in the Emergency Measures Act. He asks us to trust him. He says, don't worry, we're going to make sure everything's fine with the courts, we're going to make sure everything's compliant with the Charter. This is the same guy who fired his Attorney General because she wouldn't go along with his plans to interfere in a criminal court case, Madam Speaker. So you will pardon the members of the Conservative Party if we're not going to take the Prime Minister's word that he's not going to abuse the power that he's granting himself. He points to specific incidences that Conservatives also denounced. We denounced the rail blockades in 2020, and we denounced the border blockades in 2022. Because, Madam Speaker, we do not believe that the right to peacefully protest should mean that you get to infringe on the freedom and rights of other people. But when we raised that point in 2020, calling on the government to do something about the rail blockades when it was the anti-energy workers, who, by the way, there are a lot of radical left-wing protests across the country where you see all kinds of placards, anti-Semitic placards. You see banners advocating violence committed against police officers. You don't see the government rushing to crack down on that. They're talking about foreign funding, Madam Speaker. How about the foreign funding that's poured into Canada by the hundreds of millions to help groups fight against energy projects and natural resource projects across the country? Didn't seem to bother the government then, Madam Speaker. But now all of a sudden they say that they've got to do something about it. It's a little bit like that scene in Casablanca when the inspector comes to Rick and says, sorry, I have to close the place down. There's illegal gambling going on. And then the croupier comes over and puts his winnings in his pocket. That's what this government is doing. For years, they've relied on foreign funding coming to help their allies in the political spectrum fight for their goals and fight against Canadians and their interests. So, Madam Speaker, I'm just going to close on this. This is the exact same playbook that we've seen dictatorial governments across the country. They dehumanize their opponents. They invoke threats of foreign influence. Remember, the Berlin Wall was built to keep others out, ostensibly. Governments always talk about their good intentions when they take away rights and liberties. But I'm asking Canadians not to be fooled by this. And I'm asking members of the Liberal Party who actually believe in civil liberties, who actually do believe in the natural limits of government, to do the right.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Sport.
I had to just rush back into the House. I was sitting in the lobby and listening to that speech, and I just couldn't believe how willing the member from Regina Capel was to just justify all these behaviors we're seeing. I saw a video of him crossing the road this morning, giving a thumbs up and shaking hands with people who've been occupying this capital city for the last 3 weeks. And my direct question to the member is, if this was happening in Regina, if his neighbors were being occupied and harassed downtown and were afraid to leave their homes, would your position be exactly the same as it is here? Would you be giving them a thumbs up every single day?
speak to the chair if you don't, the honourable member for Regina Capel.
This member comes from a caucus whose leader sent a delegation to protesters. He's saying that I shouldn't wave back to people who wave to me. His government actually sent a minister with a mandate to negotiate. Madam Speaker, I'm Canadian. I'll wave at people when they wave to me. I'll say hello to people who say hello to me. When I have constituents who have left their homes to come and fight for their freedoms, I will listen to them. I will be civil. Because if the government had started off this whole thing with that type of attitude, we might not even be having this debate today, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Pagode. Thank you, Madam Speaker. As you know, the Conservatives and the Bloc are both going to vote against the motion today, but there's something that I'd like to understand. In 2012, 10 years ago, there was a student crisis in Quebec, and there were partisans of the Conservative Party who said, come on, let's go in with the hard line. And so same thing in 2020, the Bloc tabled a motion to apologize to victims of the War Measures Act, but the Conservatives voted against our motion. So all of a sudden there's this truckers' protest. So why, when it's the Conservatives' grassroots base that is in play, then all of a sudden the hard line doesn't apply? Because, and they even say that climate change doesn't exist.
Madam Speaker, my honourable colleague, first of all, I will start off my remarks by thanking the members of the Bloc Québécois, because we disagree on many things philosophically, but it's nice to know that even if we disagree on policy, that there's still some common ground on the principles about using the sledgehammer that the government's brought in. But the member is invoking a series of events that happened in 2012. The Conservative Party didn't bring in the Emergency Measures Act in 2012. Mm-hmm. It's legitimate. There are going to be protests across the country, across time, where various parties are going to agree with the aims of the protests or disagree. And we can all express our opinion about whether or not those protests should be happening. But the government should not be bringing in this massive sledgehammer to crack down on dissent when there are existing laws. The Prime Minister talked about Coots. That was resolved. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the indulgence. The Prime Minister talked about the Coots border crossing. It was resolved with existing laws, with existing tools that law enforcement have. There's no need for this act.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Saanich Grove Highlands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Honourable Member for Regina Capel, I found his speech disturbing at many levels. There were more dog whistles to a rabid base of Trump supporters in one short speech than I've heard ever in this place. But I'd like to correct the record and ask the Honourable Member to consider that when the Government of Canada sent a delegation, it was because the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have Supreme Court of Canada on their side, that they have a continuity of leadership, territorial responsibility that goes back to our Constitution, Supreme Court of Canada. The Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs required that both British Columbia and the Government of Canada, in the honour of the Crown, sent representatives to discuss the situation with them. They were not protesters, they were chiefs.
For Regina Capel.
Well, Madam Speaker, I believe the honourable member may be the only member of this House who's actually arrested for participating in an illegal protest. So for her to now somehow justify the Emergency Measures Act, would she have appreciated it while she was breaking laws and getting arrested if the government had the power to freeze her bank account, Madam Speaker? Would she have appreciated anybody who made a donation to the Green Party at that time having their bank accounts frozen for supporting her illegal activities, Madam Speaker? I doubt it.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for King's Heads.